This is a video lesson for our decimals unit for day one. The day one learning target is I can use decimals to model the decomposition of one whole into tenths. So this lesson is going to have two parts to it. The first part is going to do a little introduction to decimals and explain what decimals are. And then the second part is going to get into the decomposition or breaking apart of whole numbers into tenths, which is a type of decimal that we'll be working with today. So let's go ahead and jump into the first part of our lesson here. So the first part of our lesson is going to be explaining what is a decimal. Essentially, a decimal is another alternative way that we can write and represent values that are part of a whole or less than one whole number. So they're very similar to fractions in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to be using a tape diagram and number line here to kind of show how we represent decimals, and I'm going to be talking about the decimal value of tenths today. So looking at this tape diagram here, we're going to say that the value of this tape diagram is equal to one whole. So if you look at how many parts that this tape diagram is split into, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 equal parts. So since this whole is split up into 10 equal parts, we know that the value of each one of these parts is 1/10. And so each of these parts is equal to 1/10 of the whole. So on the number line, we have the same thing. We have 0 and 1 whole on the end here. And we know that each of these values is going to be the same. So this is also going to be 1/10. So this point right here is 1/10 of the whole. And we can continue on 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, and so on. Like I mentioned earlier, decimal is another way that we can represent values that are smaller than one whole. So we have labeled above the fractional values of these parts of a whole, each of them being 1/10. Below the number line, I'm going to write the equivalent of 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, and so on in decimal notation. So watch what I do here. So 1/10 in decimals is going to be 0.1. So we say that this value, or this number, this 1 right here, it's just to the right of this decimal point right here. We call that the tenths place. So just like we learned about earlier in the year with ones places, hundreds place, thousands place, and so on, when we're working with fractions, when we're to the right of the decimal, we have starting with the tenths place. And that's the only only decimal value we're going to be working with today. So we have 1/10, 0.1. So 2/10 would be 0.2, 3/10 would be 0.3, and so on. So 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. And then one whole, of course, just stays as one whole. So we would read this value right here as 7/10. I'm going to write it out in word form here, because we have a 7 in the tenths place. So we have 7/10. So this 7/10 is equivalent to the 7/10 represented in fractions. So you can see that decimals, when we're working with tenths, is just another way that we can represent fractions or parts of the whole. So knowing that, we are able to actually decompose numbers using decimals. So we have some experience with decomposing numbers using fractions. So I'm going to be showing how we can decompose the value of 1 centimeter, first with fractions, and then with the equivalent decomposition with decimals. So one way that I can decompose 1 centimeter, which is essentially me decomposing one whole, is I can break up one whole into 2 fractional parts and have the sum of those fractional parts equal one whole. For example, I can say that 9/10 of a whole plus 1/10, these are centimeters, 1/10 of a centimeter. If I add those together, that equals 10/10 of a centimeter, which equals one whole, or 1 centimeter. So my 2 fractional parts are 9/10 and 1/10. I can do the exact same thing with decimals, but I'm going to be representing these two fractional parts, this one right here and this one right here, in decimal notation. So writing it as a decimal number. So I would represent 9/10 as 0.9 centimeters. So that's the same as the red underlined value over here. And then I would represent 1/10 as 0.1 centimeters. And then I get my sum of 1/2 or 1 centimeter. So you see that the red underlined right here, we read that as 9/10 of a centimeter. And then the blues, both things that are underlined in blue, we would read as 1/10 of a centimeter. So that's one way that we can decompose 1/2 centimeter. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do it. Let's do one more. I'm going to start with fractions. So we have 8/10 of a centimeter. And if you think, how many more tenths do I need to add up to 1/2? You'd say, well, I need 2 more tenths of a centimeter. And that's going to give me 10/10, which is equal to 1/2 centimeter. And now I'm just going to represent these two fractions as decimals. So here I go. 0.8 centimeters, or 8/10 of a centimeter, plus 0.2 centimeters, or 2/10 of a centimeter, and that equals 1 centimeter. So that does it for our first day of our decimals unit. So hopefully now you have a pretty basic understanding of what decimals are, at least to the tenths place. And you should be able to work through all of the work for day 1 of our decimals unit. If you get stuck on any of the classwork today, you can always come back and rewatch parts of the video and refresh yourself and remind yourself of the content that we covered. So good luck with day 1 of our decimals unit, and thanks for watching.